Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. I hope you've enjoyed the break and enjoyed your lunch. It's now my privilege to introduce Senator the Honourable David Fawcett. The Senator is a former Assistant Minister for Defence and is currently the Deputy Chair of the Parliamentary Joint Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade. I'd invite the Senator to take the stand and offer us a view from the federal opposition.
Thank you for that kind introduction. I would say perhaps it's more a member of the opposition offering some hopefully informed views as opposed to the view of the federal opposition. But I do appreciate this opportunity to talk about some of the challenges about moving, as it was said this morning, through Collins to SSN AUKUS. But in doing that, I'd like to actually address three questions. Why are we doing it? What are we here for? Why are we actually engaging in AUKUS at all? Secondly, what can history teach us about what some of the challenges might be and what we may need to do in order to turn this aspiration into reality? And specifically, from a whole of government perspective, what might we need to do to address four key failure modes that I think potentially could affect the program? As to why, well, I think the case for both the SSN and for AUKUS is well established by the Defence Strategic Update of 2020 and reinforced by the Defence Strategic Review. But importantly, we need to understand that the context has changed since the Cold War of last century. Last century, free markets outperformed their communist equivalents, and the innovation of the private sector gave us both the economic and technical overmatch compared to the communist regimes such as the Soviets that we were up against. Today, the situation is different. The economic heft of the Chinese Communist Party, coupled with their rampant IP theft from both companies and universities, has enabled the PLA to grow both in size and in technological capability in the traditional domains of air, land and sea, but also cyber and space. Gone as well are the optimistic hopes that a growing middle class would actually lead to enhanced political and civil freedoms in those nations. And in fact, what we see currently is that authoritarian regimes are actually showing their true nature again. And we see that in the trampling of human rights in Hong Kong and Xinjiang, where the CCP are using modern technology, mass surveillance, to facilitate the age-old techniques of oppression. We see the illegal and unjustified invasion of Ukraine, where cyber, unmanned vehicles, hypersonics are matched alongside trench warfare, as both civilians and civil infrastructure is targeted in a blatant war of aggression. And in sum, as we look around the world, it's hard sometimes not to sort of juxtapose yourself back to the 1940s and think about Churchill. So as we see the collusion between totalitarian states such as Xi's China, Putin's Russia, North Korea, the Islamic Republic of Iran, Churchill's words come back to my mind, and I quote, "But if we fail, then the whole world, including the United States, all that we have known and cared for, will sink into the abyss of a new dark age made more sinister and perhaps more protracted by the lights of perverted science," end quote. Prescient comments in his time of June 1940, but perhaps also to our time. And so why AUKUS? Well, the Coalition initiated AUKUS and continues to support both pillars of AUKUS because history shows us that one of the keys to deterring aggression is having both the capability and the demonstrated intent to protect those things that are important to us. In terms of capability, the focused and collaborative innovation and sharing of technology is key to free nations maintaining an edge, or at least parity, over rising authoritarian states. having the courage and being prepared to pay the cost to establish these deep links in manufacturing, research and operations is a clear international demonstration of intent. Now, many of you here looking at the age demographics are probably parents, and you would know that sharing doesn't always come naturally even with friends. And I'm not talking about your children. AUKUS Pillar 1, at least in principle, has brought us a long way from the days when both the UK and the US refused to share with us the IP around things like anechoic tiles, which led to DSTO, the Defence Science and Technology Organisation, as it was at the time, to have to develop our own because our partners wouldn't share. So AUKUS, at least in principle, represents an intent from a leadership level for trusted collaboration, but the task of implementing and achieving it is quite large and without risk. As the US Assistant Secretary of State for Political Military Affairs, Jessica Lewis, has said, and I quote, "The success of AUKUS is not predetermined. It must be built," end quote. Now, to be clear, I believe AUKUS will succeed. Maybe I'm just an optimist. As an experimental test pilot by profession, I guess you could say I'm an optimist by definition. But more specifically, as an experimental test pilot, I know that all systems have failure modes, but with good systems engineering, understanding of the risk and commitment, most outcomes, even the ones that initially can appear beyond reach, can be achieved. And secondly, I believe it will succeed because the consequences of failure are too awful to actually contemplate. So as we embark on building AUKUS, there's many challenges, but I want to focus on 4 failure modes that history says are likely to risk us achieving our goal of strategic deterrence. So what I'm aiming to do is help us understand what it is we can learn from history and what are the whole of government steps that we may need to take to mitigate the risk. And these 4 areas are first in legislation and regulation. Secondly, how do we see Australian industry? Is it a cost centre or a capability enabler? Thirdly, how good are we at actually identifying and managing risk? And fourth, how are we actually doing with the Collins life of type extension, and particularly following this morning's discussion where the argument was we will get to SSN AUKUS through Collins, we obviously need to get that right. So to legislation and regulation. Anyone who's been following AUKUS will be aware of the discussions around ITAR, the International Trafficking in Arms Regulation, which is a centrepiece from the US, but most people don't know, run by the State Department, not by the Pentagon, and therein lies one of the problems. Now, it's been encouraging to see goodwill. Who knows about the Koala Act? The Koala Act actually put forward to provide exemptions for Australia around these things, not yet passed. We're all encouraged to see the US Senate Foreign Relations Committee support the amendment to the National Defence Authorisation Act. Good steps forward, but not yet complete. Because just like we saw in the 2016-17 timeframe, the late Senator John McCain, recognising the importance of collaboration and sharing with trusted allies, pushing forward the NTIB, the National Technology and Industrial Base, pushing forward to include Australia and the UK into that along with Canada. What we saw then were congressmen and senators writing to the House and Senate Armed Services Committee saying, over our dead bodies, that's going to reduce American sovereignty and might affect jobs in my electoral district. No thanks. And there are many people, myself included, who believe that the NTIB has not achieved what John McCain and others of us who supported it, it hasn't achieved what we thought it could in terms of facilitating that cooperation. And so we watch with understanding, but some concern, people like Senator Roger Wicker, who's highlighting the fact that the US doesn't have the capacity to build the subs it needs at the moment, let alone help Australia out. And so I'm attracted to the work of people like Bill Greenwald, who was an Under-Secretary for Defence Procurement and Industry under a former Republican regime, now writes for the Atlantic Council, and he makes the case, and importantly, he as a US citizen makes the case that ITAR actually serves to disadvantage the US as much as, if not more so, than other allies. And that's a case I think that we need to take up with our US interlocutors, whether through industry, whether at a congressional to parliament level, whether through departmental levels. And he gives a number of examples in one of his pieces he's written on this, on the impact of what he calls ITAR taint, and the fact that that pushes some US companies offshore to do their R&D and causes many other nations and companies to refuse to engage with the US. And the Chief Technology Officer for the DoD has actually recognised that 11 of the 14 key technologies which the US Department of Defence needs are actually developed and owned by the commercial sector, not by defence. And so the issue of ITAR taint and the reluctance of people to engage is quite significant. So we need to engage with the US on the basis of, it's not just we want you to give us your secrets, this is actually good for you to have allies and a two-way exchange of information. And that's particularly important as we look at SSN-AUKUS and the role of Australian industry in that, so that Australian industry has an opportunity to get involved not only in the design, construction and maintenance of our SSNs, but also those in other nations. And so we do need to work, as I said, across the levels to influence not just the State Department, not just the Pentagon, but also the congressmen and senators in their respective foreign relations and armed services committees. To Australia, we also have some reform that's required. The PGPA Act, the Commonwealth Procurement Rules and the Accountable Authority Instructions are central agencies' restraints that are placed on defence in terms of how they do procurement. And I can point you to any number of perverse outcomes that have come because of those constraints. And we've had a lot of talk today about the importance of continuous shipbuilding, of building workforce, getting deeper skills. And yet poor Mr Moriarty is still tending to the bruises that he copped from the ANAO recently, where he was implementing government policy about a continuous shipbuilding capability, and the ANAO said that was a poorly run project because you were spending taxpayers' money on an industry outcome and we funded you for a project to deliver the Hunter class. And so there's this disconnect between government intent, which is programmatic in nature, sovereign capabilities, and many of the enablers through the Accountable Authority Instructions, CPRs, and even our compliance organisations such as ANAO, which are still looking through the narrow lens of a temporally constrained project as opposed to a long-term program. And we need to get those enablers lined up if we want to see these survive. And the same thing goes even to things like DSR and the concept of an Australian DARPA. Yep, in principle I support it, just like I supported the Defence Innovation Hub. But if we're going to give millions of dollars to Australian industry to innovate, but then the procurement rules go, oh, but when you come to issue a contract to buy, you've got to compete and price, and whether the company's been around long enough to have a track record and therefore reliable come into it. We have spent millions on some projects to Australian industry to develop and then have bought offshore because of the impact of the procurement rules. And in the submarine space, there is no greater example than that of the sovereign industry capability priorities, the fact sheet for the sustainment of submarines, diesel-electric submarines, good list, good framework, included the batteries. With PMB, I'm sure Stephen's here somewhere, we have world-leading competitive from a technology and cost perspective batteries, but the procurement rules drove defence to compete the battery as opposed to investing in that programmatic sovereign capability. So there's some things we need to change, including our views on Australian innovation and industry. And this debate is pretty well entrenched. Happened with Collins back in the 80s. It still happens as to whether people see Australian industry as a cost centre, it's a cost burden on defence, because it's all about jobs, it's not about capability, or whether we see industry as a capability enabler. And there's a nuanced argument here For those of you who are deeply interested, can I encourage you to go online and have a look at the Joint Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade report into Procurement of Defence Capability 2015, where the committee looked at the concept of industry as a fundamental input to capability and said, how should that influence our procurement and government policy? That's what actually led to the DIPS 2016 policy statement. In my view, not all industry, but industry that is critical to defence capability is what gives us the assurance that military response options the taxpayer funds defence to provide will be available to government when they need them, will be effective against the threats that they will face, and will help them to be affordable over life of type. But if we don't get the view and the policy around sovereign capability in our industry right, then we run the risk of future collapses like we saw with Collins pre-Coles, like we saw with the amphibious fleet, and as we've seen with other platforms in the land and air domains, where the ability to respond to a threat has been limited without Australian industry. And that is true even for FMS cases. I can point to things like some of the Super Hornet deployments, Chinook deployments, where it was Australian industry that enabled us to do that because the US, as the design authority, were actually occupied elsewhere and we weren't their priority. So we need to focus on capability from Australian industry and not content. To talk about percentage content is almost like the old offsets thing. It's not what delivers good use of taxpayers' money and underpins Defence's ability to deploy capability. It's also important that we foster design expertise. Having an industry that can just manufacture to print might generate jobs, but it doesn't generate sovereign capability. And the lessons of World War II, again, says that this is not just important to Australia, it's important to our allies. During World War II, Brisbane was actually a submarine maintenance and operating base for the US Navy. In 3 years, 89 submarines were dry docked and sustained. In the case of USS Growler, substantially repaired from having the first 18 feet of the submarine bent, some way off the centre axis due to being rammed by a Japanese ship. And as I look at recent news reports of US submarines being stuck in Guam and no local repair facilities, that sort of thing has informed some of my discussions with commanders of Indo-PACOM about the importance of them yet again engaging with Australian industry, and even if it's only a supply vessel, a landing craft, engage the engineering certifications, the procurement processes that let our two systems work together so in times of crisis we can actually provide that support. To get through, to get to SSN through Collins, I think one of the key things we can do is look at what that sovereign industry capability priority template for Collins was when it first came out in 2016-17. It's a really good articulation of what it is we expect industry to be able to do to help maintain submarines. And as Coles found, it's a whole of enterprise. It's Navy plus ASC plus industry working together. And if we don't want to go through that dip and into another Coles, then why don't we take that learning, that lesson, and say, if this is what we've decided are sovereign capabilities we need industry to be able to provide, then that should be the entry point for our discussion with the US and the UK around the design of SSN-AUKUS and the integration of the supply chain from Australia from day one, as opposed to saying, yeah, the Brits will sort it out or the Americans will sort it out and we'll help people develop down the track somewhere. Because history tells us that doesn't work particularly well. And if we think there are gaps at the moment in Australian industry, then just as Defence has this great framework, it's like a systems engineering framework called Fundamental Inputs to Capability, it's no good just having the piece of kit. You need the people, the organisational structures, the individual and collective training, and you need your doctrine. Well, the same thing if we treat industry as a fundamental input to capability. If there are gaps in things that we think we need industry to be able to do for us, then we need to invest in lifting them to the standard where they can provide, from the start of something like SSN-AUKUS, what it is we think they need. The third area is risk. Now, some of you may be aware that that was my background as a test pilot. I actually have a private senator's bill in the Senate at the moment looking to respond to over 2 decades of ANAO, parliamentary and independent reviews of defence procurement that highlight we don't do risk well. But even in Collins, if you go through the RAND review of the lessons from the Collins program, and I quote here one of their lines, it says, "The important point is that the decisions were not necessarily good or bad, rather they were not fully informed by a knowledge of the risks and consequences." End quote. And so I think it's really important that we make sure, as we look towards SSN AUKUS, and I'm sure, looking down the front here, I don't see any death stares coming from the front row, but I'm sure Navy is learning from those lessons of Collins. But I am concerned, and I'll talk about this in a bit about life of type extension for Collins, where I start asking some questions around, well, do you actually have a statement of requirement? And I'm told by ASC we're not sure, and I'm told by Defence probably not, because it's just continuing the existing capability. And yet we're integrating some pretty significant systems that will have an impact on the power budget, the cooling load on the systems. There's talk from some that you might even need a new plug in the hull to actually accommodate cooling. That's a pretty major risk and change to the capability and the design if that's the case. And what I'm not getting a lot of confidence around is that the investment in the non-recurring engineering has been funded in a timely enough manner that we will actually understand the risks, the long lead time items, the work we need to meet the schedule we need to actually allow Collins, in its life extended and its normal maintenance extension, to provide the role that we need. The other point about risk is DSR talks about minimum viable capability. The only way you can assess minimum viable capability is if you've done your requirements analysis up front. And again, many examples, and I'll come back to the RAND review on Collins because it's specific to this topic. One of the things they highlighted was there was very poor definition. In fact, there was no authorised definition of requirements when the project kicked off. It's not the first project, and I fear it won't be the last. But those requirements and the translation of what do we need to test, how do we prove the requirements, are the requirements set so high they actually drive unnecessary risk in terms of what industry is capable of, and cost in terms of trying to achieve that last 5% of requirement when perhaps your minimum viable capability would save you a lot of time and money. But to do that, you need a system that has competent people to evaluate the risk and a system to transparently report that risk, not just within the service as the capability sponsor, not just within the procurement organisation, whichever form that takes, looking towards SSN, but also right through to the ministerial level of executive government in national security committees, so that all the decision makers have a common truth point of what the risk is of decisions that we are about to make. And finally, in terms of load, I'm a great fan of Collins. I know over time it's had many critics, but I see that Collins, despite some of its issues, has been a great testimony to our Navy and its operating, and I think of Waller in 2000. I don't know if either of you guys were involved with that, but the notional sinking of a couple of US submarines, nuclear submarines, by a very quiet and effective HMAS Waller, even in the early days of its systems on board, and they've only got better ever since. But it's also a testament, particularly post-Coles, to Australian industry and what it's been able to contribute. And we just had Horden Wiltshire before from Acacia talking about the work they're doing now, but some of their early work, and I think Ted's here somewhere as well, Ted Hoover, who was involved in the initial assessment of the Rockwell system not being suitable and coming up with patches for things that even the US Navy still don't have in their BYG-1 combat system around high-density target tracking. Australian industry is smart and capable, and I think the Collins program's been a great example. But my key point is that if the DSU of 2020 is correct, and if Anthony Blinken, as the Secretary of State for the US, is correct, and his assessment of timeframes to potential conflict, no matter even if SSN AUKUS goes absolutely to schedule, in fact exceeds schedule by 10 or 20%, it won't be available in the time we need. And so we need all 6 boats capable against the threats, available and affordable, which means they need to be a priority in how we work with them. And so that brings us back again to this whole concept of how do we, from a whole of government perspective in our regulations, allow defence to move. You know, we had discussions earlier this morning about workforce. And if you've got Collins and you've got shipbuilding and you've got people learning to support Virginia and you've got people looking towards SSN AUKUS, it's a massive group of people and a lot of duplication and potential overlaps where one group may be idle as a phase has passed, but there's a shortage on the other. So one of the key questions is, do we collaborate? Do we just cooperate? Or do we consolidate? And who do we choose to be the prime partner for SSN AUKUS? Commonwealth procurement rules would say you've got to go and compete. The reality is, if the designer is going to be BAE Systems and with a fair heft of US interface into that, I dare say, we already have BAE Systems here. They already have a good understanding of Australian industry. They're already taking things like composite piping to replace stainless steel piping into the design of Hunter and pushing that potentially into overseas programs. Is that a viable option where we should be saying let's consolidate sustainment for Collins along with what we do for SSN so that you can optimise the workforce? I'm not necessarily promoting that, but what I'm saying is at the moment our regulations would not make that easy for defence to do. And if we are truly concerned about the immediacy of the threat and the need to sustain Collins and build for the future, then government, and this is not an attack on the current government because both sides have struggled with this, we need to get that right. Lastly, and this will be my one partisan point, I'm deeply disappointed by both the DSR with the cost shifting that has occurred through that, the disruption which comes at a significant cost for defence, the fact that there's $19 billion that's going to go to new capabilities but no new funding. And in fact, in the budget this year, in real terms, it was a decrease in funding. That not only has an impact on defence, it puts pressures on people who are trying to do that unenviable task of balancing life of type extension, Virginia, SSN AUKUS and other assets, but also for industry, particularly for SMEs, that disruption and delay to cash flow is making many of them question whether they should continue. And I'm profoundly disappointed by that development. In summary though, the need is acute. I think we all recognise that. The task is large and the risks are real. But I do believe that if we are prepared to learn the lessons of history, if we apply systems engineering to whole of government approaches to enable decisions that will collectively help us manage the fundamental inputs to a capability that will actually achieve our ultimate aim of a free, stable and prosperous Indo-Pacific underpinned by the rule of law. Thank you very much.